This happened a few years ago when I decided to go camping alone in a national forest. I like camping, but I don't really enjoy crowded campgrounds. So instead of staying at one of the official sites, I drove further into the forest and found a small clearing near an old logging road. There were no other cars anywhere nearby, which was exactly what I wanted. I set up my tent, made a small fire, cooked some food, and spent a while just sitting there, listening to the forest. Eventually, it got late, and I crawled into my tent and went to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard something outside. Footsteps. Slow footsteps moving through leaves. My first thought was that it was probably an animal. There are deer and raccoons in that area, so it didn't seem that strange. But then the footsteps stopped right next to my tent. I could hear someone breathing. Human breathing. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought whoever was outside would hear it. Very slowly, I reached over and unzipped the tent just a little so I could look out. Sitting about 2 feet away from the entrance of my tent was a man. He was just sitting there in the dark, facing the tent. He didn't have any camping gear that I could see. No backpack, no flashlight, nothing. Just a guy sitting there in the woods at what had to be around 3 in the morning. For a few seconds, we just stared at each other. Then he said, very casually,
"Hey."
I asked him what he was doing out there. He just said he was walking through the woods. That made absolutely no sense because there were no trails anywhere near where I was camping. I told him he needed to leave. He stood up slowly and just stared at me for a moment. Then he turned and walked off into the trees. I didn't sleep again that night. And to this day, I still wonder what he was doing wandering through the forest alone, and why he decided to sit silently outside my tent. This happened when I was living alone in a small apartment building a few years ago. One night, I was at home watching TV when the intercom to the building suddenly buzzed. It was around 10 p.m. I assumed it was someone who had the wrong apartment, which happens sometimes in buildings with intercom systems. When I picked up, a man's voice said,
"Hello?"
I asked who he was. There was a pause. Then he said my name. My full name. I immediately felt uneasy because I had never heard this voice before. I asked him who he was again. He said he was downstairs and asked if I could buzz him into the building. I told him I didn't know him. There was another pause. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. He said,
"Please open the door. I'm thirsty. Can you just give me a glass of water?"
Something about the way he said it felt incredibly wrong. I told him no and hung up the intercom. About a minute later, it buzzed again. I didn't answer. Then it buzzed again and again. For the next 10 minutes, the intercom kept buzzing over and over. I sat completely still on the couch, afraid to even make a sound in my apartment. Eventually it stopped. But later that night, sometime after midnight, the intercom buzzed one last time. The next morning, I asked the building manager if anyone had been there looking for me. He said no one had been let into the building, and none of my neighbors had visitors that night either. I never figured out who that man was, or how he knew my name. This happened a few years ago when I was driving home late at night from work. I worked the closing shift at the time, so I usually got home around 2 a.m. The roads were almost completely empty that night. As I drove down one street, I noticed a black SUV parked on the side of the road. Inside the vehicle were 3 people: a man in the driver's seat, a woman in the passenger seat, and what looked like a kid in the back. What caught my attention was that all 3 of them were staring directly at my car as I drove past. Not just casually looking, staring, completely expressionless. It gave me a weird feeling, but I kept driving. A few minutes later, I stopped at a red light. Then suddenly, I saw headlights pull up behind me. It was the same black SUV. Again, I could see 3 people inside, and again, they were just staring straight ahead with completely blank expressions. When the light turned green, I drove forward. They followed. At first, I told myself it was probably nothing. But then I turned down a random street just to test it. They turned too. Now I was getting really uncomfortable. For the next several blocks, they stayed directly behind me. Finally, another car came up behind them. Right after that, the SUV suddenly accelerated and drove off in the opposite direction. I still think about that night sometimes, because I have no idea why that family seemed so interested in following me around empty streets at 2 in the morning.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy mysterious and eerie stories like these and want more, consider subscribing so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.